This is another iRaw podcast. We podcast to make the world a better place for animals.
It's both kind and rational to like knowing animals. I can't deny it's fashionable to like knowing animals.
Hello everyone and welcome to Knowing Animals. Knowing Animals is a podcast in which we speak to animal studies scholars about a piece of their work. My name's Josh Milburn and I do like knowing animals. Now today's episode is actually part of our intermittent Protecting Animals series, in which we talk to animal advocates of all different kinds about the work that they do for animals. Now before I introduce today's guest, let me just introduce the sponsors. The episode is brought to you by ASA, that's AASA, the Australiasian Animal Studies Association. ASA is one of the most significant scholarly organisations devoted to animal studies. If you're an academic, an artist, a student, or anyone interested in animal studies, I encourage you to join today. Membership is very reasonably priced and there are discounts available for students, for example. You can also follow ASA on social media, on Twitter, on Facebook, just search for them. The episode is also brought to you by the Animal Publics book series from Sydney University Press. This is a great collection of books about animal studies. Now, the series is currently accepting submissions, so if you're writing a book about animal studies, I encourage you to get in touch with the series editors to explore whether it might be a good fit. But I also add that unlike in many academic book series, the books in the Animal Publics series are very affordable. In fact, some of them are even open access, meaning that you can download PDFs of the book completely freely. Now this week, I'm joined by AJ Albrecht. AJ is the Managing Director of Mercy for Animals US and Canada, an organisation she joined in 2019. She's a lawyer and formerly chaired both the American Bar Association's Animal Law Committee and the New Jersey State Bar Association's Animal Law Committee. She's also the founder of the East Orange Animal Alliance, which is an animal activist organisation. Welcome to the podcast, AJ.
Thanks so much, Josh. It's great to be here.
So can you start by telling us what inspired you to get involved in animal activism?
Certainly. I was lucky enough to grow up in a home that included a lot of non-human animals. It seemed that my family was always rescuing cats, rescued a tarantula from a classroom that we didn't think had enough tank space. We had rats at one point. So I was always surrounded by animals in our home. And I think I didn't realize how much of an impact that had on me until I became older and began my career, which actually did not begin in animal law, but began in family law. So representing families going through divorces or domestic violence issues. And that was a very challenging career path. But I found that the cases that really filled my cup, so to speak, and gave me purpose were those that involved animals, whether that was a custody dispute or, unfortunately, situations where animals had been abused in domestic violence situations. And as a result of that and my volunteering at a local animal shelter and eventually adopting a dog who truly changed my life from that local animal shelter, I slowly but surely began transitioning towards animal law, which then became working on legislation and policies that would help animals be treated with respect as much as possible. Began my career in the companion animal space, working on issues impacting dogs and cats. As is the case for many activists, quickly found myself wanting to do more and helping animals who I thought needed help more and needed more advocates in their corner. And that's what led me to farmed animals. And I've been with Mercy for Animals since 2019. Our mission is to construct a just and sustainable food system. And we are doing that by ending industrial animal agriculture, or what we colloquially call factory farming.
I definitely want to ask a lot more about Mercy for Animals. But first of all, I wanted to ask you quickly about the East Orange Animal Alliance, because that's not an organisation I've heard of before. So what kind of organisation is that?
East Orange Animal Alliance, or just the Alliance as I usually refer to it, really came about when I was walking dogs quite a bit at this very overlooked and underfunded city shelter in northern New Jersey, where I used to live. And I realized that despite bordering on some very wealthy and abundantly resourced areas, this shelter didn't have even the basics. I mean, they didn't have toys for the dogs. They didn't have any volunteers aside from me to walk the dogs. So I formed the alliance to bring the community together and not only make them aware of the animal shelter, but make them aware that they could adopt these animals, also provide resources for families who were turning to the shelter to surrender their pets when really they didn't want to. And in the time since I started it, and I have since passed it on, and I'm cheering them on from across the country now, we went from having a very high euthanasia rate at the shelter simply because folks didn't know the animals were there to almost, or essentially now being what's called no kill, meaning that over 90% of the dogs and cats are winding up in homes, which is really wonderful. And I think what I'm most proud of is that they're also staying in homes that love them because we're able to provide resources like veterinary services or food or training and behavior support when needed so that animals can stay put.
Well, that's excellent. And it's very interesting that that's a very different space of animal activism and animal advocacy than in Mercy for Animals, which, as you say, focuses on farmed animals and the food system. So you said that Mercy for Animals is aiming to combat factory farming, to change how we eat and how we feed ourselves. What kinds of strategies, what kinds of approaches does Mercy for Animals take there?
We employ quite a few different interventions because we really see this as an issue that in order to crack the nut, so to speak, we have to be approaching it from lots of different angles and seeking change in many different arenas. So the work that we do ranges from government affairs, which is at both the state, local, and federal levels of government, seeking to pass new laws or amend existing laws so that they are more protective of animals, farmed animals, and undermine these deep-seated structures of factory farming. We also have a corporate relations and campaigns departments, and those are focused on getting corporations to do two things. One, change their animal welfare standards so that they are more humane, using air quotes with more humane. Of course, we recognize that the most humane thing is just ending animal farming entirely. But that could look like getting rid of cages and crates for animals, ensuring that they have more space to turn around, spread their wings, etc. Then the second area of corporate work is on the plant-based sphere. So getting corporations to include plant-based options and shift some of their animal-based food offerings toward plant-based ones. We also have a project called the Transformation Project, which is a really visionary project that our president, Leah Garces, brought to Mercy for Animals back in 2019. And we are partnering with farmers who used to be under contract with these large meat companies and no longer want to factory farm. They want to grow plants for human consumption using these large existing CAFOs, or concentrated animal feeding operations, that they already have on their land. These are the size of football fields in some cases, and we are giving them the resources and information and research really that they need to be able to use them to do things like growing mushrooms or hemp, or in one case, even using a former chicken house as an animal shelter for stray dogs. So we are very proud of that project as well. And of course, really, Mercy for Animals is focused on also shifting this narrative. And that narrative that I'm referring to is the one that big ag or industrial animal agriculture has created, one that makes us think meat is the only way we can survive, and then it needs to be cheap, and it needs to be readily available everywhere we shop and consume food. And we're working to make sure that that's not the case, that there are other options and that there are delicious, affordable, and accessible options to everyone who wishes to try them, which we hope is everyone over time.
So as managing director of Mercy for Animals in the US and Canada, I take it that you have an oversight role over all of these sub-projects.
Yes.
So my question is, how do you select which kinds of approaches to favour and which ones perhaps aren't your area of attention at the moment?
It's a really good question, Josh. And a lot of it comes down to politics, as you can imagine. When it comes to our government policy work, we focus very closely on whether or not elected officials who are either with us and believe in our mission or are pretty close to us on that spectrum of allies, meaning we believe that they may be neutral on these issues and we can move them towards what we're trying to accomplish, whether they're in office and willing to work with us. So that has a large part of this. There's also when it comes to the corporate work in particular, there is a certain level of really knowing the political climate again. So I'll give you an example, which is during COVID. Obviously a devastating time for majority of the world, but there actually was a silver lining for the farmed animal protection movement in that it really started to shine a light on our broken food system, and you started to notice cracks. And it wasn't just us that were noticing those cracks, us being those in the movement, but really the general public. Folks started to pay attention to the fact that slaughterhouse workers, for example, were dying in alarming rates of COVID-19, even more than people who are incarcerated. And that's because they are being forced to work, and meat production was being prioritized over their health and their family's health. People also started paying attention to supply chains more. We're also seeing that presently in the US in particular with the avian flu outbreak and eggs being much more expensive now. So we really pay attention to the political climate as well as what's impacting consumers. But at all times, these interventions are ongoing, and there's ebbs and flows as to which one might have more of my attention or which we might be galvanizing volunteers around. Our organizing department is also a large part of this work, and really just keeping our finger on the pulse of where we can create incremental change in the short term while keeping our eye on this long-term goal of, just to quote our vision, a world where animals are respected, protected, and free is truly the long-term goal.
So this long-term goal would be a vegan world, do you think?
Yes, unfortunately, the realist in me recognizes that that's not something I'm going to see in my lifetime, but we do believe that having a very ambitious vision of animal liberation and allowing animals to pursue their own interests, just like you and I, for the most part, are able to, is the dream, so to speak.
What does a day-to-day work day for you look like?
Depends on which day. I can't help but laugh because, as you can imagine, overseeing all of our US and Canada programs, there are surprises. But generally, it looks like, if I had to sum it up in a few words, connecting the dots. So all of the directors that I have the privilege of overseeing and working closely with, they're so immersed in their work and they're so focused on their end goals that it's really my privilege and my job to be able to say, hey, our director of government affairs is working on this, director of organizing. Did you know that? Why don't you chat? Because I think this could be a larger campaign that encompasses more of our work. Of course, it also includes opportunities like this and getting to speak to people like you about our work, which is truly one of my favorite things about the position. Similarly, traveling to conferences and ensuring that we're finding collaborative spaces with both allies that we've long time held and also unlikely allies who we are excited to find common ground with and build this movement even further.
The reason I ask that question is that a lot of my students, for example, are quite interested in getting into this kind of work. They'd love to work in the animal activist space. And of course, I always say that there are challenges with this. Mm-hmm. But from your perspective, what kind of steps could people take if they were interested in pursuing the kind of work that you do?
First and foremost, I would say volunteer. As you heard at the outset when I shared my experience, I really dipped my toe into the animal world, both the dog and cat world, and then later the farmed animal protection world through volunteering. That can look like, of course, probably the most accessible and easiest for folks to find is volunteering at an animal shelter or an animal sanctuary for farmed animals. But Mercy for Animals has significant volunteer opportunities as well. And that can look like everything from marches and getting out in the street literally to activate and call attention to these issues, to digital actions where you don't even have to leave your desk and you're writing to elected officials or communicating with them via Zoom or things like that. Because volunteering allows you to see what organizations are working on and allows you to be exposed in a way that you really can't see if you're truly on the outside and not getting involved. And it will help you figure out what you enjoy doing. I recognize, since you mentioned your students, that it's also a privilege to be able to volunteer, and many students are working very hard at jobs, and student loans are a real thing. So I can't help but also plug that Mercy for Animals has paid internships. We do pay our interns, which we think is very important. And those opportunities are about 3 months long, about a semester's length long. I think interns are really exposed to a lot of work at our organization and sister organizations as well.
I know you're based in the US and Canada and you oversee the US and Canada, but Mercy for Animals is very much a worldwide organisation, isn't it? So
Yes.
these volunteering opportunities, are they available almost anywhere in the world?
Mercy for Animals is a worldwide global organization, and we do have internships and volunteer opportunities through our other regional offices. So that includes India, Mexico, Brazil, and we're also expanding to other regions as well. So yes, our website, mercyforanimals.org, will list those opportunities.
Now, this podcast normally features academics, and a lot of our listeners are academics. So could you tell us about what kind of role academic research and academics have for Mercy for Animals? So, for example, what kind of academic research you draw upon when you're developing initiatives and pursuing campaigns? And do you ever collaborate with academics?
Significantly, actually. I could go on and on about all of the research work that we've done recently, but just a few examples that have been so helpful to our work. We actually have a research team at Mercy for Animals that is comprised of largely former academics who are now working in-house for us, but they collaborate and call upon their network of academics frequently and consistently. A couple of years ago, we did focus groups to figure out what language we should be using to speak about certain policies we were working on. Where we wound up is calling them climate-friendly food procurement policies. And essentially what they do is shift government food purchasing away from animal-based food products towards more plant-based ones. And the focus group helped us figure out how to talk about those. So that's kind of the social science research aspect. We also frequently draw on animal welfare research. So, for example, right now, a hot topic in the farmed animal space is controlled atmosphere stunning for chickens, which is essentially the idea that a certain gas, there are many different types that could be used, is used for chickens to not be conscious before they are stunned. And we believe that this is still, of course, not ideal, as we spoke about earlier, but more compassionate than live shackle slaughter, which is really a horrific method of slaughter. But we need more research on the cognitive effect of controlled atmosphere stunning on chickens, what pain they're feeling, and we're consistently calling upon academics for things like that. Many other examples, but all of that to say that we are very grateful for this research. We recognize that research is invaluable when it comes to formulating our interventions and our campaigns. And Mercy for Animals is also proud to say that we are nimble enough that if new research comes out that actually changes our position, we're able to do that. And we are consistently doing that because we, at the end of the day, want to be scientifically sound and making choices and employing interventions that match with the data and research that's coming out.
What kind of future campaigns do you see on the horizon for Mercy for Animals?
One thing that we're really excited about is as it relates to that transformation project that I spoke about earlier. We will be, over the next year, working with farmers to create what we're calling demonstration hubs. And what those will be is former factory farms where the farmers have converted to growing plants for human consumption or specialty crops. And it will be a place for other farmers to come convene and learn and see what it looks like to do this. It will be a gathering space for shared learning, sharing resources. We'll be intentionally having these in different geographic areas so that the weather in these different places can transition to different farmers and it can be relevant to the way that they farm. And we're really excited about that because it's creating models and sharing what's possible. And we believe that these models are replicable, and it's just a matter of getting the word out there and making it accessible for other farmers and stakeholders to see so that they can employ the same type of transformation. In the corporate relations sphere, we're really focused on what we're calling accountability. We worked very hard to get a significant number of commitments from corporations over the years to improve their animal welfare conditions. We've largely been focused on meat chickens or broiler chickens. And those commitments are coming due. And unfortunately, we have not seen as much progress as we should have seen since those commitments were first entered into. So we're very focused on reaching out to those companies, asking for roadmaps of how they are going to reach these commitments to their consumers. And quite frankly, we're going to be playing hardball if these corporations are reneging on those commitments. We recently ran an ad against Kroger, showing that Kroger can't be trusted is our tagline because they have gone back on a commitment. And we anticipate having more tactics like that in the future because when a promise is made to consumers, we believe it's our duty to have it be upheld.
A quick question on this work that you're doing with farmers, though presumably the same question could be asked about the work you're doing with corporations. These people you're working with, are they people who've had a change of heart about animals, or are they people who are just responding to a particular economic climate?
I can't generalize across the board, but most of our transformation enrolled farmers are folks who started out as family farmers who were farming in a very, very different way that they wound up farming after they entered into contracts with these huge meat companies. So they went from being small business owners who were working the land and treating their animals with much more respect than a factory farm operation treats them, to being unable to compete because that's the way big ag in the US is structured, and entering into a contract with a large meat company such that they quickly found themselves underwater, no longer living their values, having, yes, as you said, a change of heart, but also just realizing that they drifted further and further away from this vocation of farming that they loved. And I say vocation because all of our transformation enrolled farmers, for the most part, this is not how they earn money. In fact, it's how they sink themselves into debt, and then they have another job to actually earn an income and try and keep up with that debt. We've found that these partnerships are invaluable to us, of course, because it's allowing us to help these farmers find a different path, which they're so eager for, but also so valuable to these farmers because for the longest time, many of them have believed that farmed animal protection advocates or animal rights activists are just completely against them and want nothing more than to see them fail or even go so far as see them in jail. We've found a certain level of trust and collaboration, and it's been hugely symbiotic in that way, in that we're both benefiting from this partnership, but probably no one is benefiting more than the animals.
Now, AJ, we ask every guest on Knowing Animals 5 quick questions, and regular listeners will notice that these protecting animals questions are a little different to the usual ones. So you ready for your 5 quick questions?
I'm ready, and I'll do my best to give quick answers.
Can you recall when you first started to think that there's something wrong or problematic about non-human animal relationships?
Well, this is a story that I've been told for a very long time, but it happened when I think I was 3 years old. So while I might not entirely remember it, I've been told it enough times. My mother, along with a few other parents, brought a play group of us 3-year-olds to a turkey farm shortly before Thanksgiving. And all of the children were enjoying putting their fingers through the fence and interacting with these turkeys, and they're about the same size as us. And I, although I was usually a pretty outgoing and vocal child, was hanging back and really not participating. And the parents came over and asked me if I was okay or what was going on. And I just said with huge, wide eyes, how are they going to kill all of these turkeys? At the time, I think it was retold as kind of a funny story, and like the morbidity of a 3-year-old can be somewhat amusing. But as I've gotten older and I've reflected on that, I think it shows that already at 3 years old, I was questioning this food system that we created and this kind of deep-seated understanding that at Thanksgiving, you kill a turkey and you eat it. I think I was that young when I started asking these questions.
Can you recall the first thing you did to try and bring about change for animals?
Yeah, I was really just volunteering at an animal shelter. As soon as I realized that that was a need in my community, I started spending significant time there. That would have been when I was in law school. So I think I benefited just as much as the animals having those interactions.
If you had to name one animal advocate who's had a big impact on you, who would it be?
So this is one that I've probably reflected on the most since I knew this question was coming. And there's so many I could say. I mean, Jane Goodall, Greta Thunberg, John Robbins, the written work of these folks and seeing them speak in some cases has really impacted me. But if I'm being completely honest, I think it's my mom. Just having a mother who, without question, would always say yes if an animal needed care, was someone who would bring neighborhood animals to the vet for other families because they needed care, would help wildlife. I think that that was just instilled in me in such a young age that that would be the biggest impact.
What do you think is the most important thing that advocates can do for animals?
Reducing consumption of animal-based food products as much as possible. And of course, in my ideal world, if I were to wave my magic wand, that would mean that all of us were plant-based or vegan. But any change, any reduction is a great change. And that could look like meatless Mondays or not eating any meat for the majority of the day. This is really at this point when we are slaughtering close to 10 billion animals per year in the US alone, 9 billion of those being chickens. This is the number one thing that we can do as humans to help animals. And there are so many delicious recipes out there to try. And if you don't like cooking, you can even pull up to a Burger King at this point and choose a plant-based option, which is really an exciting time.
If you had the power to change one thing about the human-non-human animal relationship, what would it be?
I would broadly just say more respect for each other, coming from a place of wanting to understand each other more. In my personal life, I'm very into dog training and positive reinforcement training and learning together with dogs. And I think that that can transition into all of your interactions with animals. Just they're not acting silly or acting crazy in most cases. They're acting that is innate to them. And if we approach it with wanting to understand and respecting those differences, I think the world would be a much better place.
What are you working on next?
So as I mentioned, the transformation hubs are a big part of my work right now. And then I mentioned the corporate work. And finally, I'd love to talk just very quickly about the Farm Bill. And that is in the United States, every 5 years, the agricultural bill that is passed by Congress that unless changes are made, the same law is passed every 5 years. So essentially, we're advocating for amendments to the existing law. And the large collection of amendments that we're working on is called the Industrial Accountability Agriculture Act. And what that does is really shifts this responsibility of all of these broken aspects of our food system back to factory farms and back to these big meat companies. So it does things like amend what methods of mass on-farm killing can be used so that they're not so horrific. It adds chickens and turkeys to the Humane Methods of Slaughter Act so that they're treated more humanely. So it's really incremental positive changes. It does quite a few other things, but the Farm Bill is being negotiated now. It's very active and it's taking up quite a bit of our focus.
How can people find out more about your work and indeed more about Mercy for Animals?
So Mercy for Animals website is mercyforanimals.org. We're also very active on social media. Our handle's Mercy for Animals on pretty much any social media platform you can think of at this point. And then I myself am quite active on LinkedIn in the professional sphere. My name is on there as AJ Albrecht, and I'd love to connect.
Well, thanks, AJ, for joining us for this podcast.
Thank you so much, Josh. It was great chatting with you.
And thank you, listeners, for joining us for a special episode of Protecting Animals, which is a spin-off series from Knowing Animals, the podcast where we talk to animal studies scholars about their work. You can follow us on Twitter at knowing_animals or on Facebook at Knowing Animals. You can also follow me on Twitter at Josh L. Milburn or on Instagram at A Vegan Philosopher. Please do tell others about us and review the podcast where you found it. Reviews make it easier for others to find us. I'm Josh Milburn, and I do like knowing animals.
For more great iRaw podcasts, visit irawpod.com. That's IROARPOD.com.